A lot of men were buying it and reading it. A lot of women were buying it for their men. But I wanted to reach men before they became men. I wanted to reach...
Good afternoon, everybody. On this Monday, December 15th, 2025, I've got all your stories lined up for the rush hour ride home. And today's show is absolutely jam-packed with major developments and fast-moving updates. You're going to want to stick around for... We're starting with shocking and deeply tragic news involving Rob Reiner and his wife, a story that has sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. Their son has been arrested, bail has reportedly been set in the millions, and details are still emerging as the industry tries to process what happened and how it reached this devastating point. We'll break down everything we know so far and separate confirmed facts from speculation. We'll also dive into the latest escalation in the Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni legal battle, where Baldoni's legal team has raised eyebrows with their strategy and public framing of the case, essentially arguing that Blake exaggerated what they see as a relatively minor issue. I'll walk you through their reasoning and share exactly what they stated in support of the Wayfarer party's motion for summary judgment. Beyond that, we have updates from the tragic shooting in Australia, with new information coming in that adds important context to an already heartbreaking situation. And speaking of shootings, Luigi is now officially on trial, and a conspiracy theory has been gaining traction online, one that many of you have been messaging me about, insisting I take a closer look, so I'll explain what that theory is and why it's spreading. Finally, we'll touch on more drama in the podcasting and Bachelor-adjacent universe, where Nick Viall has been replaced by Bravo's Stassi Schroeder, and tensions are rising fast as behind-the-scenes details start to leak. It's a lot to get through, but we're here to cover it all clearly, carefully, and honestly, and all of these stories and more start right now on The Rush. I don't know exactly what Nick was dealing with, but according to reports, there was a very loud argument on Saturday night that was intense enough for multiple people to hear, with sources close to the Reiner family telling TMZ that Rob and Michelle left the party shortly afterward, and it remains unclear whether Nick left at the same time, which raises the disturbing possibility that whatever happened may have unfolded later that night or into Sunday morning. Either way, it's absolutely heartbreaking. What makes this even more haunting is a resurfaced interview clip from nearly a decade ago, where Rob Reiner spoke candidly about his relationship with his son and the lengths a parent will go to protect their child, saying his main job was to keep his child safe and that he would do anything to do so. In the same clip, Nick talked about how they didn't bond much when he was younger, how their interests were different, but how seeing his father engage passionately in something he cared about made him feel closer to him. Hearing Rob say who would do anything for his kid, and then confronting the reality of this case while still emphasizing innocent until proven guilty adds an almost unbearable layer of tragedy. One commenter claimed that Nick is schizophrenic and struggled with drug addiction, and while that hasn't been officially disclosed, the idea of severe mental illness combined with substance abuse paints a picture of a potentially volatile and dangerous situation. It also underscores a painful truth. Rob and Michelle lived in a $13 million mansion, were financially secure, successful, and beloved, yet none of that was enough to overcome whatever demons were at play, whether mental health issues, addiction, or something else entirely. It's a sobering reminder that wealth, status, and access don't automatically equal solutions, and that, as a society, we are still failing when it comes to having honest, effective conversations about mental health and addiction. Because if a family with every possible resource couldn't prevent this, what chance does anyone else have without a broader, more serious national effort? Adding to the shock, a response from the president followed, and it was as appalling as many expected. Given Rob Reiner's long-standing and outspoken opposition to Donald Trump, the statement quickly crossed into territory that many would consider grotesque, with Trump claiming that Rob Reiner and his wife died as a result of anger caused by what he called Trump derangement syndrome, framing their deaths in a cruelly political and self-serving way while praising his own administration and declaring a cold, golden age of America. It's hard to overstate how disturbing that is, and it may go down as one of the most despicable statements ever made by a sitting president in response to a tragedy. The irony is staggering, because true derangement is the inability to separate fact from fiction, the complete blurring of reality by obsession and grievance, and that is precisely the world Trump appears to inhabit, seemingly fueled entirely by anger toward others. It's almost as if conflict and resentment are the only things that energize him, a pattern you sometimes see in people who thrive on confrontation just to function, except here it's playing out on a national stage, in the aftermath of an unimaginable loss. This idea that if you're not constantly bending the knee and worshipping him, you're instantly labeled as arch-nemesis is completely unhinged, and it's honestly shocking that this is the kind of response we've come to expect. Even Thomas Massie, one of the very few Republicans willing to publicly speak out, called it what it was, saying that regardless of how anyone feels about Rob Reiner, this was inappropriate and deeply disrespectful discourse about a man who had just been brutally murdered, adding that his GOP colleagues, the vice president, and White House staff would likely ignore it out of fear. and openly challenging anyone to defend it. And that's really the core of the issue. We've heard people argue in the past that when someone like Charlie Kirk died, parts of the left celebrated it. And while it's true that some individuals did, that was wrong, but I don't know of any serious public figures who did so. I want to live in a world where we can have intense, passionate debates without violence becoming the backdrop or the response, where disagreement doesn't strip us of basic humanity. People were quick to say, "See, Republicans don't dance," on people's graves. And then the president, the leader of the Republican Party and of the country, turns a brutal tragedy into what amounts to a campaign speech, which is just despicable. To reset the tone, let's talk about what a response should actually look like, because Barack Obama provided a textbook example, expressing heartbreak alongside Michelle, honoring Rob Reiner's immense contributions to film and television, acknowledging his belief in the goodness of people, his commitment to living those values, and offering sincere condolences to those who loved him. That's it. That's a non-narcissistic, humane response to a tragic loss, and the contrast couldn't be more stark. What makes all of this even sadder is that none of it surprises anyone anymore. And that's the real problem. We've normalized behavior that would have once been universally condemned, rewriting the rules of how we respond to tragedies simply because it involves the president, whether you call it dementia, deterioration, or just a total collapse of restraint. It's a man shouting from the rooftops while those in power stay silent because they're afraid of his base. Even as that base continues to shrink, when people warned that talking about politics would cost me half my audience, they were wrong. We've only grown, because people may not always agree with my opinions, but they respect honesty and the willingness to engage in real give. And while some have accused me of having Trump derangement syndrome, I think moments like this make it clear who's actually grounded in reality and who isn't. The fish rots from the head, and watching our country slide toward conditional empathy where compassion depends on which side of the aisle someone is on is something we're all seeing in real time. Whether we want to admit it or not, we see it playing out here because we've lost that sensitive connective tissue, the basic sense of decency and restraint that's supposed to hold us together. So let's move on from that and get into the Blake Lively situation, because there's a lot to unpack. Baldoni's team has now filed a reply memorandum in further support of the Wayfarer Party's motion for summary judgment. And in plain English, this is Baldoni telling the judge, here's exactly why this entire case should be thrown out. And to be fair, his legal team clearly knows not just the law, but how to communicate, how to cut through the noise and get straight to what they argue actually matters. They accuse Blake Lively of spilling an enormous amount of ink trying to manufacture factual disputes where none exist, pointing out that the key facts are undisputed, and that even her own Rule 56(1) response confirms she launched an aggressive legal campaign over what they characterize as minor workplace grievances they say were already resolved during production without any need for litigation. According to the filing, Lively lists a series of alleged incidents ranging from yelling and defensiveness to a conversation she herself initiated about a redacted topic, as well as an incident she reportedly assured others at the time was a non-event and cannot claim continued after she asked for it to stop. The memorandum goes on to argue that Lively cannot prove any actionable sexual harassment, asserting that nothing in her opposition changes the reality that she's describing low-level behavior, trivial complaints, and petty slights that may have been annoying or uncomfortable but do not rise to the standard of a discriminatory or hostile work environment. The filing even suggests that Lively herself appears to recognize Baldoni's conduct doesn't meet that threshold, which is why her case ultimately boils down to a single comment made after she raised the subject herself. From their perspective, this is a classic case of turning routine workplace friction into a courtroom battle that never needed to exist. They further argue that she is now attempting to make Heath a kind of poster child for sexual harassment, based on a brief glance in an already awkward situation after which Lively undisputedly told him, "I'm not saying you were trying to cop a look." They also address the incident involving a video related to Heath's child's birth, shared in the context of producing a film with a prominent childbirth scene, noting that it is undisputed the same or similar image was shown to Baldoni and another individual, both of whom found it entirely inoffensive. And perhaps the most cutting line in the entire filing is their conclusion that it is remarkable that after months of discovery, Lively cannot produce anything more substantial, which ultimately leads to the question Baldoni's team wants the judge and everyone else to ask: if this is truly as serious as it's being framed, then where is the evidence? Where is it? That's the question that keeps coming up, and in a moment we'll get to a response from legal commentators pushing back on some of the pro-Blake Lively crowd who seem unwilling to accept that there simply may not be anything here. The filing itself drives that point home relentlessly, stating that it is remarkable that after months of discovery, Lively still cannot produce evidence sufficient to justify the enormous legal and judicial resources devoted to this case, especially given that whatever concerns she initially raised were fully addressed once she brought them forward. Even Lively does not meaningfully dispute that the entire second phase of filming, including all intimate scenes involving her, proceeded without incident. The memorandum further argues that she cannot establish that the conduct at issue was aimed at her or anyone else because of gender, which is a basic prerequisite for a sexual discrimination claim, noting that she concedes the alleged conduct affected women and some men alike. Several allegations, such as improper hugging, are effectively abandoned because she cannot dispute that both men and women were hugged, and, notably, that Blake herself was also hugging people. The filing even leans into the obvious point that many people like hugs, and that context matters. Similarly, references to sexiness, they argue, were indisputably tied to a film centered on adult themes and romantic relationships, not used to pit one gender against another, which aligns with the reality that this wasn't an Office Max workplace but a movie about love, attraction, intimacy, and the emotional collapse that follows when love turns into something darker and more possessive. Lively's complaint that Baldoni improvised physical intimacy is also addressed, with the filing stating she offers no evidence that any improvisation was intended to offend her based on gender, emphasizing that Baldoni was not targeting her as a woman but performing in character while filming a scene. That, ultimately, is what this comes down to. Remembering that this was a film production, not a random workplace encounter. The document also notes that Lively was invited to discuss her boundaries and concerns about intimate scenes with a female intimacy coordinator before filming, undercutting claims that she was left without support or options. Her attempt to sidestep this by characterizing the film's birth scene as unscripted nudity is called absurd, with the filing pointing out that she claims she was unexpectedly required to imply nudity under a hospital gown and prosthetic belly, despite being a mother of 4, and presumably aware that people generally do not wear pants while giving birth. The argument continues by addressing allegations that Baldoni's comments about personal experiences were gendered, countering that it is undisputed those statements were substantially similar to things he has said publicly in talks and books aimed primarily at male audiences, reinforcing the position that this was not gender-based discrimination. Finally, Lively cannot dispute that 3 witnesses testified Baldoni asked Heath to show her the birth video for non-gender-based reasons following discussions about the film's birth scene, further reinforcing Baldoni's central claim: strip away the rhetoric and the framing, and what remains is not evidence of actionable harassment, but a series of contextualized, resolved, and largely ordinary moments that never should have ended up in court. How could conduct possibly be considered severe or pervasive if it completely stopped once the issue was raised, so much so that Lively, acting on the advice of counsel, concluded that no formal HR process was even necessary? That question alone cuts straight to the heart of the case, and it's why Baldoni's team is so confident that Lively would have no chance in front of a jury. They also take apart her attempt to bolster her claims by invoking the alleged experiences of other women, pointing out that there is no evidence she was even aware of most of these incidents prior to litigation, assuming they occurred at all. The implication is clear. This looks less like a pattern she endured in real time and more like a post hoc effort to build a coalition after the fact, reaching out to others and, in the critics' view, trying to rally support. From an employment law standpoint, the filing emphasizes that Lively did not suffer any adverse employment action whatsoever, and that it is now beyond dispute that no material aspect of her job changed for the worse. Her compensation didn't go down, her role wasn't diminished, and her standing on the project remained intact, which alone is enough to defeat her fear claims. The memo then flips the narrative, noting that it was Lively who unfollowed Bald, setting off social media speculation, and Lively who disparaged him to her famous friends, a detail that becomes particularly interesting if this case ever reaches trial. Her opposition, they argue, fails to identify a single factual false statement that the defendants shared or promoted in response to what they characterize as an onslaught against Bald. While she complains that the defendants exposed her to criticism for past conduct, she does not dispute that those criticisms were already public long before any alleged publicity effort by the defense. And perhaps most damaging, the record is conspicuously devoid of even one piece of evidence showing the defendants initiated a retaliatory publicity campaign because she raised concerns on set. The document goes on at length, point after point, methodically hammering away at the same conclusion. So I'll throw it to you. Do you want me to read the entire thing? If you haven't already, hit subscribe. And if we get 100 new subscribers on this video, I'll sit down and read the filing in its entirety, probably over the weekend. Because if you're interested in the real meat and potatoes of this case, it is genuinely fascinating. Here's not actually Golden explaining why she has a serious issue with what she calls the so-called pro-women community rushing to defend Blake Lively, saying her trust and patience with that space continues to erode, especially with what she describes as a resurgence of aggressively pro-Lively commenters who aren't just supportive but openly rude and hostile, framing disagreement as moral failure. What stands out to her hand, frankly, to many observers is how some of Lively's supporters have angled this narrative so that if you're not on Blake's side, you must be anti-women, even if it's not always stated outright. There's an unmistakable gendered undertone suggesting that supporting Lively is synonymous with supporting women, while questioning her claims somehow makes you complicit in misogyny. In a typical workplace scenario, where a powerful boss behaves inappropriately toward a subordinate, that framework might make sense. But Golden points out that this isn't that situation. Even if Lively was technically just an actress, her cultural capital, influence, and industry power placed her in a dominant position, not bold, which complicates the simplistic victim versus villain framing. It's nuanced, uncomfortable, and that's exactly why some people don't want to engage with it. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the Nick Viall situation today. I had planned to, but we're moving at warp speed, so I promise we'll cover that in the morning episode. I do want to briefly touch on the Luigi Mannion case, because there's a conspiracy circulating that many of you have been urging me to address. To be clear about my position, I currently believe Luigi did kill Brian Thompson. And I also believe that murder is wrong and that's why he's on trial. I don't believe this was terrorism. And while I think our healthcare system is deeply broken and in desperate need of reform, violence is not the answer. That said, the conspiracy centers on police. Body cam footage allegedly showing that an initial warrantless search of Luigi's backpack at McDonald's turned up no gun, and that only after the body cam was turned off for 11 minutes during a second search was a gun discovered. I'm not fully convinced of this narrative yet. Reports indicate police recovered one gun initially and later found another believed to be connected to the killing, which suggests there were two firearms involved. Still, the fact that body cam footage went dark before the discovery of critical evidence is, at minimum, troubling and worth scrutiny. It's entirely possible Luigi pulled the trigger and could still walk free if his constitutional rights were violated. And that's why this matters. People keep messaging me saying this is huge, and I agree it deserves attention. But I'm not persuaded by claims that he was framed wholesale or that the evidence was entirely fabricated. To me, the more compelling and unanswered question is why he did it. I've reviewed the claims about planted evidence, mismatched backpacks, and ballistics confusion. And while police reportedly found a loaded magazine and later a handgun in Magnon's backpack after his December 9 arrests linking him to the December 4th CEO killing, the sequence of events raises legitimate questions. Still, if Luigi was carrying a gun, using a fake ID and evading a manhunt, I'm going to need a lot more proof before buying into the full conspiracy narrative. Then there's another claim circulating, this time from Attorney General Pam Bondi, who announced that the DOJ and FBI thwarted what she called a massive terror plot in California, involving the Turtle Island Liberation Front, described as a far-left pro-Palestinian, anti-government group allegedly planning bombings and attacks on ICE agents. I'll be honest, I don't take Bondi at her word. Given her history of politicizing investigations and stretching narratives, the immediate labeling of the group as far-left raises red flags about motive and framing. And while it's entirely possible there's real evidence behind this claim, I need to see it before I accept it as anything more than a political win being packaged for public consumption. Finally, circling back to the tragic shooting in Australia, we're learning more about a bystander who acted heroically, tackling one of the shooters and potentially preventing further loss of life. Even in the midst of horror, it's worth acknowledging moments of extraordinary courage, people who step forward when everyone else freezes, and we'll continue to bring you more on that as details emerge. Here, you see moments like this where bystanders step up in the most unexpected, extraordinary ways, and it genuinely restores a bit of faith in humanity. One important nuance that came out fairly early and deserved to be highlighted by the media is that the man who intervened is Muslim, a fact that matters in a climate where narratives are so often distorted or weaponized. What struck me most about his actions, though, was not just the courage, but the restraint he showed under unimaginable pressure. He does not shoot the father, the primary perpetrator, even though under American laws, certainly in a place like New York, he likely would have been legally justified in doing so, given that the man had already demonstrated he was an imminent danger to others. As the shooter moved back toward his son, who was also involved, any reasonable person would be thinking, is he going to grab another weapon? Is this about to start all over again? And yet, despite that risk, this man chose restraint. He allowed the main shooter to flee rather than escalating the violence, and in doing so, he ended up taking 2 rounds himself, one to the hand and one to the arm. That is real heroism, and there's no other way to describe it. It's especially meaningful in a country where Christianity is the majority religion, and where, historically, acts of terrorism have often triggered waves of Islamophobia, something we saw very clearly after 9/11s. The reality is that multiple things can be true at once. It is horrific when individuals or groups, whether it's terrorists or radicalized actors like the Boston bombers, believe violence is the answer to cultural, political, or ideological grievances. And it is equally true that people of the same faith or background can and do act with immense bravery, compassion, and moral clarity. Holding those truths together isn't always easy, but moments like this remind us why it's necessary. It's absolutely tragic, particularly considering the timing during Hanukkah, when the Jewish community should be able to practice their faith in peace without fear, or questions about whether security needs to be ramped up at synagogues. Moments like this are a stark reminder of how vulnerable people can feel simply for observing their traditions. And while the Muslim population represents roughly 25% of the world, many people don't fully grasp that, which makes it all the more important to separate the heroes from the villains in these situations. In this case, there is an undeniable hero, someone who acted with restraint and bravery, stepping in to save lives, and we can expect fundraisers and support not only for him and his family but also for all of the victims affected by this tragedy. We need to find a way to live in a world that doesn't pour gasoline on already toxic fires, where wars and violence are too often justified by hatred of others' religions. It's heartbreaking to see radicalized individuals commit these acts. And yes, in our country, there's often a focus on mental health when someone commits mass violence. And that is part of it, but psychosis and radicalization that motivate people to pull the trigger are far more complex. I don't have all the answers, but it's clear we need to do better. Technically speaking, humanity has never lived in a completely safe time. Conflict has always existed, but that doesn't mean we can't strive to create a safer, more just world. Much of this stems from divisive ideologies, the "my God is right, your God is wrong" mentality that has fueled wars throughout history and continues to radicalize individuals today. Even in our own country, similar justifications arise. Our democracy is better, our ideology is better, and these kinds of beliefs, when weaponized, lead to catastrophic acts of violence. Radicalized individuals acting on